We love a good superhero story. The brilliant general, the outnumbered underdog, the single, game-changing weapon that turns the tide. It's how we talk about war. We focus on the dramatic moments, the tactical genius of a commander on a hill, the daring cavalry charge. It's clean, it's compelling, and it makes for a great movie. Because of this, we consistently misread conflict. We get lost in the search for a silver bullet. We obsess over the ace fighter pilot or the advanced missile system. While the real war, the grinding, unglamorous war of production, logistics, and attrition, happens off-screen. It's the war of spreadsheets and railway timetables. It's the war of factory output and grain harvests. It's boring. And it's what actually decides who wins. This is why our memory of the American Civil War is so profoundly misleading. The popular story is a grand tragedy of brilliant Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee outmaneuvering clumsy Union commanders, only to be crushed by the North's sheer numbers. It's a story of tactical genius versus brute force, a story of courageous cavaliers versus an industrial machine. But what if that story has it all backward? What if the Union's victory wasn't an upset, but an inevitability? The North's pre-war adoption of Hamiltonian economic policies, specifically federal support for industry and a national transportation network from the 1820s onward, created an integrated logistical and industrial war machine that made Union victory a certainty. Modern wars of attrition are won by the capacity to produce and deploy resources, not just by tactical brilliance on the battlefield. The Civil War wasn't won at Gettysburg or Antietam. It was won decades earlier in congressional debates over tariffs, canals, and railroad subsidies. To understand how this hidden economic engine was built, we have to go back, not to the first shots at Fort Sumter, but to the political battles of the 1820s and 30s. We have to look at two competing visions for America's soul. One was a vision of an interconnected, industrial nation bound together by commerce. The other was a vision of an agrarian empire, built on cotton and tied to global markets. This is the story of how that choice, that fundamental bet on the future, forged the weapon that would ultimately decide the war. In the 1820s, a Kentucky politician named Henry Clay looked at the young American Republic and saw a nation in danger of falling apart. He saw a country of isolated states, separated by mountains and rivers, with economies that had more in common with Europe than with each other. His fear was that these states would drift into their own orbits, becoming rival powers instead of a unified nation. Because of this fear, Clay championed a radical plan he called the American System. It wasn't just a policy, it was a blueprint for a national machine. Think of it as a three-part engine. Part 1, a high tariff, a tax on imported goods to protect America's infant factories from British competition. Part 2, a powerful national bank to provide credit and a stable currency. And here's the crucial third part, using the money from those tariffs to fund a massive infrastructure boom of roads, bridges, and canals. Clay's strategic goal was to create a closed economic loop. The industrial North would make finished goods. The agricultural West would grow the food. And the South would provide the cotton for the northern mills. The canals and roads were the arteries, connecting it all into one self-sufficient, continent-spanning economy. But Southern leaders saw Clay's system as a strategic threat. A high tariff meant the British would buy less of their cotton, and the European goods they wanted would cost more. A powerful national bank felt like a New York conspiracy to control their finances. And federal spending on infrastructure in Ohio or Pennsylvania looked like a scheme to enrich the North at the South's expense. This led them to make a calculated counterbet. They rejected Clay's vision of an integrated national economy. Instead, they doubled down on what they already had, the Cotton Kingdom, an immensely profitable but dangerously specialized agrarian system built on enslaved labor and free trade. Their economic lifeline didn't run to Boston or Philadelphia. It ran across the Atlantic to the textile mills of Liverpool, England. Two futures were taking shape. Two Americas were being built on the same continent, operating on entirely different economic software. One was building a complex, integrated system designed for internal growth. The other was perfecting a simple, extractive system designed for export. What they didn't know was that they were also building two completely different kinds of war machines. Because two Americas had been built, two different kinds of war machines were now switched on, and at the helm were two men who perfectly embodied the systems that produced them. In Richmond, there was Jefferson Davis, a West Point graduate, a former Secretary of War, a man steeped in the Southern planter aristocracy. Davis saw the world through the lens of honor and martial valor. His strategic bet was a direct reflection of the South's economic lifeblood, its relationship with Europe. The plan was called King Cotton Diplomacy. It was simple, and in their view, foolproof. The textile mills of Britain and France were ravenous for Southern cotton. Davis and his cabinet calculated that if they withheld it, those great powers would face economic collapse, forcing them to intervene on the Confederacy's behalf. The war would be short, decided by a few glorious victories on the battlefield led by superior Southern generals, and then sealed by foreign recognition. It was a strategy built on confidence in their exports and their elite fighting culture. In Washington, there was Abraham Lincoln, a corporate lawyer for the railroads, a product of the rough-and-tumble internal economy of the West. Lincoln had no formal military training. Because of this, he listened, and the man he listened to was the aging, physically frail, but strategically astute General-in-Chief Winfield Scott. Scott laid out a plan that horrified the politicians and newspaper editors in Washington. It was mocked in the press as the Anaconda Plan. It was a war of economic strangulation. Scott proposed a massive naval blockade of the entire southern coastline, cutting off their access to Europe. At the same time, a huge army would seize control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. There would be no grand, decisive battle. Instead, the Union would slowly, methodically, squeeze the life out of the Southern economy. Think of it like a siege, but on a continental scale. Scott's plan was unpopular because it was ugly, expensive, and long. It promised a war of grinding attrition, not heroic clashes. Here were the two blueprints. Mavis's plan was an offensive, diplomatic gamble, a bet that outside forces would rescue them. Lincoln, embracing Scott's logic, chose a slow, industrial grind, a bet on the North's own internal systems. The Confederacy was looking for a knockout punch. The Union was preparing to win by suffocation. What nobody in Richmond understood was that Lincoln's unpopular, long-term strategy was only possible because of an unseen weapon the North had been building for 30 years. A weapon you could see on any map if you knew where to look. If you want to understand why the Union won, don't look at a roster of West Point graduates from 1860. Look at a railroad map. That map tells the entire story. It is the physical evidence of the two competing economic visions that had finally come to war. The southern map shows a sparse, fragmented system. Tracks radiate inland from port cities like Charleston and New Orleans. Why? Because these lines were built for one purpose and one purpose only: to get cotton from a plantation to a ship bound for Liverpool. They were not designed to connect to each other. Southern states, fearing economic domination by their neighbors, intentionally used different track widths, different gauges, making it impossible for one state's train to run on another's tracks. A shipment from Atlanta to Richmond was a logistical nightmare of unloading and reloading cargo. It was a collection of conveyor belts, not a network. Now look at the North's map. It's a dense, sprawling, interconnected web of iron, a direct result of Henry Clay's American system. This network wasn't built for export. It was built for internal commerce. It connected the factories of New England to the iron mines of Pennsylvania and the farms of Ohio. More than 22,000 miles of track, most of it standardized to the same gauge. It was a continent-spanning circulatory system, ready to pump men and material wherever they were needed. This system was a latent weapon of war, waiting for a commander. That commander was not a general. He was a railroad engineer named Herman Haupt. Lincoln, the old railroad lawyer, saw in Haupt a man who understood that modern war was a problem of logistics. Haupt was tasked with militarizing the Union's railroads. He organized the U.S. military railroads with ruthless efficiency, creating construction corps that could rebuild a torched bridge in a matter of days. He famously declared, "I care not for the glory of the battlefield. My business is to bring up the supplies." While Confederate armies often struggled to move and feed themselves just miles from their own farms, Haupt could move an entire army corps, 20,000 men with artillery and supplies, 500 miles in a week. The South had Robert E. Lee, a master of battlefield tactics. But the North had Herman Haupt, a master of the timetable. And in a modern war of attrition, the timetable would prove more decisive than the sword. While the North mastered the timetable, the Confederacy faced a much more fundamental problem: the problem of asterisk things. Purse. Their armies were led by some of the most tactically skilled officers of the age. But what did their soldiers shoot? Where did their cannons come from? Because the South had built its future on an agrarian, Jeffersonian model, it entered the war with virtually no industrial capacity. It was a nation of farms, not factories. This is why the story of Confederate ordnance is the story of one man's desperate, calculated miracle. His name was Josiah Gorgas, a Pennsylvanian by birth who sided with his wife's home state of Alabama. Gorgas was given an impossible task: create an entire arms industry from nothing, in the middle of a war. He was ruthlessly effective. He established a colossal gunpowder mill in Augusta, built arsenals and foundries across the South, and sent agents to Europe to smuggle in machinery. He turned church bells into cannons, and turpentine stills into copper refineries. But here was the inescapable truth. While Gorgas performed logistical alchemy to produce a few hundred rifles a week, the Union's Springfield Armory alone was churning out nearly 1,000 asterisk a day. The North didn't need a single genius like Gorgas. It had a system, a vast, interconnected, and redundant industrial base, built over decades by Hamiltonian policies that favored manufacturing. If a Union factory burned, 10 others took its place. If a machine broke, a dozen shops could make a replacement part. Gorgas's achievement was a testament to his personal skill, but it was also a warning. His frantic, brilliant improvisation was pitted against the North's calm, relentless, and scalable production. It was a contest between a master craftsman and an assembly line. And in a war of attrition, the factory that never sleeps will always win. The North's industrial might had a second arm, one that reached not inland by rail but outward by sea. At the war's outset, the Union's aging top general, Winfield Scott, proposed a strategy that was widely mocked. It seemed boring, passive, and utterly devoid of glory. He didn't call for a grand, decisive battle to capture Richmond. Instead, he called for a blockade. He wanted to wrap the U.S. Navy around the entire southern coastline and simply squeeze. The press derisively called it the Anaconda Plan. But Scott, a veteran of the War of 1812, understood the Confederacy's structural weakness. The South was an export economy. Its entire financial model depended on selling cotton to Europe to import the manufactured goods it couldn't produce itself, especially the weapons of war Josiah Gorgas was struggling to make. Scott's plan was to turn the South's greatest economic asset into its greatest liability. He aimed to sever the artery connecting the Confederacy to the world. Because of its industrial base, the Union could execute this plan. Northern shipyards began a massive construction program, launching hundreds of steam-powered warships. At first, the blockade was porous. Daring blockade runners slipped through with rifles and medicine. But year by year, the Anaconda tightened its grip. The Union Navy grew larger, more powerful, and more effective. This is how a boring strategy wins a modern war. While Lee was winning dazzling victories at places like Chancellorsville, the price of salt in Richmond was soaring. While Confederate cavalry rode circles around Union armies, Southern quartermasters couldn't find enough leather for shoes. The Anaconda Plan was the slow, methodical application of economic power. It proved that tactical victories mean little if your nation is being quietly strangled, block by block, port by port. While the Anaconda Plan squeezed from the outside, the Union deployed another, more dynamic weapon on the inside. It was a weapon hiding in plain sight: thousands of miles of iron rail. But here's the problem. A commercial railroad isn't a military railroad. Northern tracks were a chaotic patchwork of different companies, different track gauges, and competing schedules. They were built for profit, not for invasions. This is why Abraham Lincoln, a former railroad lawyer, understood he didn't just need trains. He needed a system. He found his system builder in a brilliant, difficult civil engineer named Herman Haupt. Haupt was tasked with a seemingly impossible job: turn this civilian mess into a coherent war machine. Because of his authority, granted directly by the Secretary of War, Haupt created the U.S. military railroads. This was a revolution in logistics. Haupt's crews could rebuild a destroyed Confederate bridge in a matter of days. They standardized repair techniques and prefabricated bridge trusses. They seized and operated rail lines with military efficiency, ignoring civilian schedules and corporate owners. The result was a logistical dominance the Confederacy could never match. In 1863, when a Union army was besieged in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the U.S. military railroads performed a miracle. They moved over 20,000 soldiers and their equipment 200 miles from Virginia to Tennessee in just over a week. It was an unprecedented feat of strategic mobility. Confederate General James Longstreet, attempting a similar but shorter move with his own troops, took weeks. This is what happens when a nation invests in infrastructure. The North's pre-war Hamiltonian bet on an integrated transportation network paid its ultimate dividend. The Union didn't just have more railroads, it had the federal power and engineering talent to weaponize them. The engine of commerce had become the engine of modern warfare. So we've seen the northern factories that never slept, we've watched the Anaconda squeezes the southern coast, and we've ridden the military railroads that moved armies at impossible speeds. These were the physical arms of the Union war machine. But what was the invisible heart that pumped the blood through all of it? What paid for every rifle, every warship, every mile of track laid by Herman Haupt's men? The final, decisive battlefield of the Civil War wasn't in Gettysburg or Vicksburg, it was on Wall Street. Because of Alexander Hamilton's vision decades earlier, the North had a sophisticated financial system. It had a stable currency, established banks, and the ability to borrow money on a massive scale by selling war bonds to its own citizens and to international investors. When Lincoln needed to fund the war, his Treasury Department could raise billions. It was this financial power, the ability to convert the nation's wealth into immediate military capacity, that fueled the entire industrial effort. This was the hidden mechanism behind it all. The Confederacy had no such system. Its wealth was tied up in land and enslaved people, assets it couldn't easily liquefy. Faced with a similar need to fund a war, Jefferson Davis's government had only one effective tool: the printing press. They printed money. And then, they printed more. This led to catastrophic hyperinflation. By 1864, a pair of boots in Richmond could cost over 500 Confederate dollars. An officer's salary for a month couldn't buy his family a week's worth of groceries. While the Union's economy boomed, the Southern economy was being destroyed from within. This reveals the ultimate truth of the conflict. The war was not a contest between the scrappy, brilliant generals of the South and the plodding, bureaucratic generals of the North. It was a contest between two economic systems. One was an agrarian export economy, built on a states' rights ideology that resisted centralization. The other was an industrializing, integrated economy built on a Hamiltonian belief in a strong federal government to promote industry and finance. The Civil War was the first truly modern war, and it teaches us a lesson that defines power to this day. Wars of attrition are won by the side with the deeper pockets and the stronger balance sheet. It proved that a nation's real power isn't just in its armies, but in its ability to produce, to transport, and above all, to pay. If you found this eye-opening, hit subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden causes. Leave a comment. What's another historical event that was decided by economics, not just battles?